So let me first welcome our two international guests, Mrs. Chun-Yi Lee of the University of Nottingham and Mr. Ho-fung, who teaches at the Johns Hopkins University in the US. A warm welcome. Let me also welcome Karin Fischer, our moderator and a VIDC consultant who worked with me on the concept of today's panel discussion. Welcome. No, you're not supposed. Let me say a few words on the context of this evening. So in our VIDC economic discussion panels, we took a look at our globalized economy, its driving actors, its contradictions, and also the underlying causes of the repeating economic, environmental, and social crisis that we are seeing. First, about 2 years ago, we explored the possibilities to reconcile economic and environmental goals. The next panel analyzed the supporting role of the nation state in developing a capitalist economy, and I think maybe we could come back to the role of the nation state also tonight. In particular, we talked about the competition between states and within states when, for example, regions within a nation state start to compete against each other. And in January this year, we discussed the still dominant role of oil in our economy and the geopolitical implications of the quest for oil and gas. So today we will have a closer look at a global player with a particularly strong appetite for resources, also oil, so we look at China. And we will also have a look at the internal dynamics and the driving actors of the Chinese so-called boom economy. So Serve the People, the title of today's discussion, is taken from a speech from Mao Zedong delivered on September 8 in 1944. And Mao Zedong wrote this speech to commemorate the death of a soldier who participated in the Long March. The concept of serving the people became then one of the core principles, and is still one of the core principles of the Communist Party of China. But in the context of today's discussion, we could ask ourselves, does the Chinese miracle serve the people, the Chinese people? And what is the current Chinese economic model? And is it linked also to the Mao period, or is it a complete break with the Mao period? So now finally, let me introduce our moderator, Karin Fischer. She is head of the Political and Development Research Department at the Institute of Sociology at the Linz University, as well as a consultant to the VIDC, as I already mentioned. She is the chairwoman of the Mattersburg Circle for Development Studies at the Austrian universities, and I would like to hand over to her now. Thank you. Have a nice evening and an interesting evening.
Thank you, Martina. Before discussing whether the Chinese economic boom serves the Chinese people, let me briefly introduce our two guest speakers. Chun-Yi has come to us from Nottingham University, where she lectures at the School of Politics and International Relations. That's her research focus. She works on the industrial relations, the production system in China, and she investigates how locations and people and workers are located within global value chains. And she does research on investment strategies. She wrote a book on Taiwanese entrepreneurs and investors in China and wrote about the complex relationships between those investors and the central government and the local governments in China. Very interesting book. And recently, she does more research on labor issues, on labor relations, on labor protests, on unrest. And among her many publications, I will only mention this special issue of a journal called Globalizations. If you have online access to this journal, please visit it. It is a brilliant compilation of articles dealing with Chinese labor in the global political economy. Great to have you here. Our second speaker, Ho-fung, is an associate professor at he's teaching political economy at the Department of Sociology at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. His main areas of interest are political economy, obviously, and protest. He wrote a brilliant book on demonstrations, riots, protests in China from the 17th century to the beginning of the 20th century. It was published in 2011, right? Yeah. And his second book is called The China Boom. It appeared in 2015, where he looks at the reasons of the rise, but also on the frontiers, on the problems associated with this economic boom, and we will hear about that later on in his presentation. He publishes a lot. You will find articles on the internet, also published and translated in German. You will find a lot. He's publishing in academic journals and in public or more popular journals. And he is writing a third book, as he told us, on China and the Global South. We're waiting for that. So the podium is yours. A few words on the organization of the evening. It is a wide range of topics that I have already mentioned, but we decided to focus on the Chinese economic model. So if there is a Chinese form of capitalism or capitalism in China, we will hear about that from Ho-fung. This is the first presentation. And then we have a second presentation from Chun-Yi on labor issues and labor protests and resistance in China. And then we have a second round on the podium where we will deepen some aspects of the two presentations. And then the second half of the event, we will open the floor to you, to the audience, and to your questions. And I'm sure we will have a lively and enriching debate. So, Ho-fung, please go to the desk and start your presentation. And please tell us if there is something like a Chinese capitalism and where the boom comes from and where it is heading tonight.
Yep. Thank you. And thanks VIDC, and thanks Karin and Martina and colleagues from VIDC for your hospitality, for your invitation to me to visit beautiful Vienna in the beautiful times. And I have prepared a lot of slides, but to start with, I only have like 15 minutes. So I'm going to go over some of the main points, and in the Q&A, we can go in depth in some of the issues. And as Karin mentioned, that my talk basically will be based on my most recent book, The China Boom, and some of my Chinese friends don't like the cover, and but I'm not responsible for that. It is my publisher. This is the Columbia University Press, because when I finished the manuscript, it was 2014. So it is a book that I talk about the historical origins of why China has been doing so well economically compared to other large developing countries, and what are the challenges that lying ahead. And at the book, I already predict that China is going into a long slowdown, and it would be translated into all kind of political and geopolitical problems. So it was 2014 when the China slowdown was not that obvious, and then the publisher getting ready to publish it, and in the summer of 2015 there was the stock market problem, and also the currency devaluation, and then the publisher gave me this photo of a lot of pop balloon, and I always emphasize, but a deflated balloon that can be reflated again, that actually the Chinese government is trying to do. And of course, the subtitle is Why China Will Not Rule the World is a direct dialogue with Martin Jack's book that was very popular back in 2008, 2009, that When China Ruled the World. Martin Jack is like a journalistic scholar and writer, used to be with the British Communist Party, and editor of the Marxism Today, the party journal. But after the Soviet collapse, he became a third-rate writer that with Tony Blair and things, and then he wrote the book When China Ruled the World. So it reflects a lot of Western, particularly left-leaning scholars, expectation that China might become the new hegemon, new leader of the world that will be more egalitarian and more fair compared to the US hegemony. So I'm saying that it is not going to happen anytime soon. And then many of my colleagues and friends in the Western world are upset about it, that they think that no, China is going to be the leader of the world. But interestingly, that when the Chinese official press, that the CITIC publishing, and it is one of the publishing house belong to one of the biggest state-owned conglomerates, CITIC, and translate my book into simplified Chinese and publish it. And they make the subtitle of the book, "Why China Will Not Rule the World," become the title of the book in the Chinese version. So it seems that while my Western friends are upset by my prediction that China is not going to rule the world, and the Chinese, at least the official press, is happy to see that oh, we are not ruling the world, don't worry. And also, because of my critical view of Chinese political economy, my many kind of friends who are very enthusiastic about the China model and seeing it as a new hope for all developing world are upset that I point out all the problems of the model. But in the end, that after the Chinese translation was published, the Chinese official press, one of the official newspaper of the Communist Youth League, the China Youth Daily, and also recently I find out there's another review from the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee Party History Office, also published a sympathetic review and saying that, oh, I'm correct, what the book said is true and correct. And then that it started to worry me because I have been very critical, and then when they start to say that it is correct, that I suspect that they might change something in the translation and whatever. But after I read the Chinese translation, I find very interesting that a lot of critical thing or even sensitive thing that I expect them would cut out haven't been cut out, like my reference to the 1989 student movement and the crackdown. They didn't cut out that part, but there's one part that is related to the core of the issues here, that they systematically change a term I use. Whenever I refer to capitalism in China or Chinese capitalism, and in the translation, they change it to socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. So, so officially it is politically incorrect to say that there's capitalism in China. So you can talk about the 1989, you can talk about corruption, but don't talk about capitalism in China, please. And so it is socialist market economy with Chinese characteristic. And then I think about the discussion in China. So what do they mean? Why they don't recognize there's capitalism in China? Because so many things are obviously capitalist, that the profit motivation is driving the behavior, wealth accumulation is driving the behavior of many people. But one distinct feature of the Chinese system right now that is not capitalist, fully capitalist, is the property relation. They're still debating it. There's some reformers saying that it needs to be changed, but now the official line is that there's low absolute private property in China. That it is state ownership of everything, land, urban land, rural land in particular. When you buy a piece of land for development, you don't actually buy the ownership right of the land. You buy the land use right. So you have a right to use the land for a definite period of time, 30 years, 50 years, sometimes 70 years. And then it is renewable, and then the government can take it away anytime if they think that it is for public goods. The same as the urban lands, so that you don't have absolute private property in China. You only have kind of a right to use particularly land property. So some reformers saying that it is not good because it opened up the pathway for abuse, because the leasing of the right to use the land is designed by the local government, local party committee. So there's, particularly in the rural area, there's a lot of protests that the party official just terminate the land use right of the peasants, tilling the land and then turn it into a real estate development project. So there's a lot of these abuse, and some people think that it needs to be changed to establish a Western style or fully capitalistic private property. But then the old guards and then in the party is saying that no, you can't change that because it totally changed the character of the system if you establish the Western-style private property right. So it is still debatable. In China, there's still two factions debating whether you establish the Western-style absolute private property right. But right now, it's not yet a reality that the state still owns nominally, at least, everything. And so that leads to some other problem, is why so many wealthy people in China are anxious to move their money out, to buy an apartment in London, in New York, because if you translate your Chinese wealth to this private property ownership in these Western countries, that you have the absolute property right. You can continue to hand it to your children, your family, and you own it perpetually. While in China, you can always depend on the Chinese government renewal of your property. So, but besides that, everything else is driven by the capitalist logic of accumulation and of profit. So it's why they don't recognize Chinese as fully capitalist, but yet you see the behavior of actors and enterprises fully capitalist. And of course, one of my main arguments is that in that regard, that China is no different from other capitalist countries and capitalist economies, because the logic behind the economy is profit motivation and wealth accumulation, despite the fact that they don't have absolute private property. But at the same time, China is different from earlier East Asian economies and other developing countries in the sense that the China boom in the 1980s, 1990s, and onward were driven by two things. But actually, in the end, it was driven by one thing, that is export. And China can become a huge export powerhouse and has a low-cost labor that they can depend on much longer than other East Asian economies like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, because of the Maoist legacy. There are two dimensions of it. One is that in the Mao period, there was a collective farm, the People's Commune system, and there's a lot of discussion about how efficient it is, whether it is responsible for the famine in 1959, but one crucial thing that this People's Commune system achieved is to establish socialized healthcare and also socialized primary education for the peasants. So you look at all these comparative status, for example, that many people like to compare India and China because they start out as a very similar level of development in the 1950s. But in terms of literacy rate, particularly in the countryside, and particularly among the women in the countryside, China is achieving more than 90% that of the rural women are literate, while in India it is much lower. And also the health issues that through the socialized medicine in the People's Commune, that they managed to eradicate most of the contagious disease in many Asian and many developing countries. And the recent Nobel Prize winner, the Chinese doctor, is the one that used the Chinese herbal medicine to find a kind of a low-cost cure for malaria. That is one example. It is the product of that era of socialized Medicare in the countryside. So when China started to open up, and then foreign capital from Taiwan, from Hong Kong first, and then later from the German car factory and all other countries. So they already have a huge rural surplus labor that is not only low cost, but also literate and more healthy. And in the 60s and the 70s, when foreign investors, for example, went to Malaysia, went to Indonesia, tried to set up factory, that the biggest challenge that they face is always that first, the workers might not be literate. So there's a lot of work to do to instruct them how to operate the machine, how to do the things. The second is that many contagious diseases is a challenge. That when you bring in so many people from the countryside to be crowded in a factory, to TB, malaria, and all these kind of disease, sometimes will break out and then disrupt the production. But in China, in 1980s and 1990s, that many foreign manufacturing capital didn't find this problem so they're taking advantage of the Maoist legacy of the countryside. And of course, that another part of the Maoist legacy is this household registration system, that they don't allow the rural people to move to the city. A lot like in Soviet Union and other Central Eastern formerly socialist countries, when they start to do market reform, that the population is mostly urban, that the rural population is no longer dominant. But the Mao regime managed to keep most of the peasants in their birthplace in the countryside. So for the peasant, it's bad that they cannot move to the city. But also when it created a situation that when China started to open up for foreign manufacturing capital, that more than 80% of the population is still rural. So they are rural surplus labor. And when they move to the city, and then they leave their kids and their families in the countryside, so the labor reproduction part of the cost of the labor is done in the countryside, which is much cheaper. So they send money back to the country, to the family, and then and work only in the factory. And then after a while, that they went back. So it explained the vast surplus labor in the countryside and this rural-urban dynamic. Explained the length that China managed to export the cost advantage in its export sectors, and on top of the literacy and the health of the workers. So it explained the export sector. And so in the 1990s and onwards, Chinese engine is export. But also export lead to a rise in foreign exchange reserve. Then so China see a escalation and huge increase in foreign exchange reserve, so that the Chinese banking system, still controlled by the Chinese government, can use this foreign exchange reserve backing to keep printing money and issuing loans in local currency, in renminbi, to local government and then state-owned enterprise to build stuff, infrastructures. And in Southeast Asia, for example, that they also rely on the banking system to print the central bank print money, and then the banking system to issue loans for investment in real estate and all infrastructures. But it run into trouble because this loan expansion is not backed by rapid increase in foreign exchange reserve. So we had the Asian financial crisis of 1997 because of the overexpansion of the loan without the backing of adequate foreign exchange reserve. So China managed to do this kind of a debt finance, loan finance, hyper-speed growth in investment infrastructures and real estate development because of the backing of the foreign exchange reserve, which is expanding, and it came from the export sector. So many people say that China has two engines, export and investment, but actually it reduced to one engine, which is export, because without the export, without the rapidly increasing foreign exchange reserve, that this debt finance investment cannot sustain for that long. But the dynamic change, that came to the problem part. So it was why China has been doing so well. But the situation changed in 2008 with the global financial crisis and the euro crisis and the US rebalancing, that the export market is still growing, but not as fast as before for Chinese export. So the growing of the export of China slowed down, and then the growing of China's foreign exchange reserve also slowed down. And at the same time, the Chinese government has farewell loan stimulus package in 2009-2010. China tried to prevent kind of a dragging down by the global financial crisis, so the government pushed a button to let the state bank to redouble its lending efforts to lend money to build stuff, high-speed rail, housing, and all these kind of airports and steel mills and all this investment. So in 2009-2010, that the annual rate of increase in outstanding loan is more than 35%, 40%, but at the same time, export was slowing. Foreign exchange reserve increase was slowing, so it led China into a problem, that this debt finance investment finally reached a point where the expansion of or increase in profit in the profitable sector, which is the export sector, and the sector that rake in foreign exchange reserve cannot catch up. So this, so it's why now we hear all these questions about this debt crisis in China. That of course this debt crisis is very different from Latin American and African debt crisis in the 1980s, because the China debt is not external debt; they are internal debt. So just the central bank in China keep printing money and then issue loans for the local government and for state enterprise to build stuff. So it's internal loan. It is more like Japan in the 1980s and 1990s. And so they are internal indebtedness. But it's growing very fast. And according to, there are different estimations about its outstanding loan to GDP ratio, but the consensus is now is in the neighborhood of 270% to 280% of the GDP, of the total outstanding loan, and it is still increasing, approaching 300%. So when export sector slow down, and then China productivity growth slow down, and the whole economy slow down to 6.5 to 7% right now, still a decent rate of growth. But it is not the most important figure to look at right now. Even if you trust the number, many people don't trust the number, but I trust the number. But even if you trust the number, the problem not come from this 6.5 to 7% annual growth rate, but the ratio between the economic growth rate and the loan growth rate. Now the economic growth rate has halved from double digit to 6.5 to 7, but the annual loan growth rate is still double digit. 12%, 13%, and in 2016 is 15%, more than 15%. So, which means that the loan growth is faster than the economic growth, meaning that the loan to GDP ratio is going to accumulate. And with this debt accumulating, many of them definitely will be the bad debt, non-performing loan. So how do you do with it? So it is the problem that many capitalist economies, it's not special to China, many capitalist economies encounter. Now it is a fashionable economic theory by Minsky that is about this loan and financing. So it is very fundamental to capitalist finance and capitalist system. So China is not unique. So there are different ways to deal with it. In the US way, they just let some some enterprise to go bankrupt to do a Schumpeterian creative destruction, like they let Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008, and then let a lot of people go bankrupt, foreclose real estate property, and then everybody go into trouble. It's a big explosion to address through this. But China and actually Japan in the 1990s also facing this expanding loan to economy problem. They're very afraid of this kind of a big Schumpeterian solution of creative destruction because it is so disruptive. Particularly in China, it will create political instability. So right now, the Chinese government is trying to delay the problem of the bad debt by whenever there's a bank, whenever there's an enterprise running into trouble, about to default, the Chinese government will come out and help to bail them out. It's what Japan has been doing since the 1990s. So the good thing about this solution is that you don't have a 2008 US financial crisis style big blow up. But the bad thing is that you have a long slowdown of the economy and creation of a huge number of zombies company. That what it described the Japanese bailed out banks and enterprise. So sooner or later, somebody got to pay this debt. If it's not the enterprise, if it's not the bank, then it is the taxpayer that support the fiscal resources of the government that used to bail out the bank. So somebody's going to pay. So before this loan problem was sorted out, that China is going to a path of long slowdown. And I always say that you are not going to see a spectacular explosion or collapse of the economy. It's not going to happen. It's more like a Japan problem in the 1990s and onwards. There's ups and downs, but it's a long slowdown. And then to end, and to connect to what Chun-Yi could say about the labor issues, is that there are two different solutions to revive productivity and profitability and to ultimately clean up the debt problem. One is so again, it is very typical capitalist that we already learn about it by reading Lenin's Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. There's no moral, you don't need to have a moral judgment on it, but it's the logic of capital that if you are accumulating domestically and you run into this falling profit rate and financial issues, then one of the way out is to export the capital to places where you can expect more profits. So it is one reason why China is very proactive and aggressive in exporting its investment abroad. With Africa first, Africa has a different dynamics because the China going to Africa policy was formed during the time when the commodity price and oil price is going high, sky high. So China want to lock in the resources. But later on that the commodity price dropped, and then it's not that a big reason for China going out now. But the reason for China going out now is to export the capital to more profitable place, to digest the overcapacity, because China just have too many steel mills. too many capacities in building railroad, and they cannot find any place to build with the profitability in China. So they need to find somewhere else to build. And so it's why next month there is going to be a big party of the One Belt, One Road, and all these One Belt, One Road countries are going to join a summit hosted by Xi Jinping. So it is all this kind of export of capital solution that find new source of profitability overseas. And then there's a contradiction here. There is a problem here because as Lenin said, when you export your capital overseas, you have a problem of how to secure the security of the economic interest of your capital in the destination of your capital export. So in the end, One Belt, One Road into Central Asia, in South Asia, and all this Chinese investment, that who is going to protect this investment? That US and traditional European countries, they have the global governing institution on their side, they have the diplomatic and military power projection capability. For example, that you lead the US Navy to patrol the trade link from the Middle East all the way to Japan to fend off against all these pirates and terrorists and whatever. When China is doing this outward expansion, sooner or later, China will need to face this problem and how to protect this long trade route and investment connection, nodal points and things like that. So it is challenging. So it's not as easy as the media will tell you that the One Belt, One Road. So it is one possible solution that we've challenged. The other solution that linked to the labor question is that redistribution. That the Chinese government since 1999 has talked about the fact that China has been dependent too much on export and fixed asset investment infrastructure. We need to pump up the domestic household consumption and pump up the service sectors, which is consumer service and retail service and all these service sectors as a new driving force of the economy to rebalance the economy. That the Chinese government has been talking about it for decades, but it is not very well because it's not going very well because in the end it is a redistribution issues. That there's a myth about the Chinese saver. It's like everybody is very frugal, Confucianist, and don't know how to spend, don't know how to enjoy life. So you change the culture, and then they will spend like American. But it is not that. Many Chinese families cannot even afford some basic, like computer for the kids, extra pair of shoes for the children, and things like that. So the consumption is growing, but not as fast as investment. So the consumption share of the economy have been dropping rapidly, not because people are reluctant to spend, but because the high saving rate in China, you look at the disaggregation, mostly corporate saving and government saving. And household saving is a small portion of it. And household consumption and household income growth is like this, while the GDP per capita growth is like this. So most of the distribution of the profits and the fruit of the prosperity of the boom is going to the enterprises, particularly state-owned enterprises and government officials, while the average household share of the income is falling, and then the consumption is falling. So in order to move China to a service economy, a real consumption-driven growth, or at least increase the share of the economy, it ultimately lead to increase the household income share of the economy, and it involves redistribution, and in the end, it is related to the question of wage, the question of labor relation, and the question of labor politics. So I better stop here. Yep. Yeah.
Right. Ho-fung, you said that one solution or future scenario is capital export, Chinese capital export, which would also imply kind of inter-imperialistic rivalry or problems to protect this capital. Yeah?
Yes.
In Africa and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the other possibility would be to foster the domestic economy and to, but this would imply a political endeavor to redistribute wealth and incomes. And this is not only a question of, it is a question of labor, but also of the relations of forces, and if the
exactly.
You want to answer?
Response that yes, that it leads kind of
concretely.
why the consumption is not going as fast as it lead to be for rebalancing, because there's nobody representing the consumer. And for example, when I go to Brazil and when I go to India, that my Indian friends and Brazilian friends always say that to boost consumption is easy. The government can just hand out consumption voucher or do this income transfer that the very famous Brazilian, both the familiar, the family income transfer thing. That you can do direct income transfer. Then the household income of the poor people will rise, and then they can consume more. But the dynamics is different because in India and Brazil, the government, the incoming party has the reason to do it because it can be translated into vote. In China, they don't have this question, this problem. And one particular example that my favorite example is that right after the 2008 financial crisis, and the Chinese government was discussing how to weather the storm and then to do this stimulus. And then many warm-hearted and progressive reformers say that let's don't waste the crisis, let's do the rebalancing by boosting consumption. So they are advocating government resources to boost consumption. But in the end, that the policy was twisted because the original policy proposal was that government hand out consumer vouchers to the rural families to buy electrical appliances and computer and all these kind of things. So it's directly transferring income to the peasant's household to buy this necessity in the household and in education and things like that. And then the industrial lobby came in and then tried to change in the end they succeed, change the policy. Then in the end, the stimulus policy to boost consumption of electrical appliances and computer end up not being the consumer voucher directly to the peasant household, but extra subsidies to the manufacturers of these electrical appliances and this computer making company. So they receive the subsidies and promise to turn this subsidy into discount to their peasant consumers. So it still managed to boost up consumption of electrical appliances and computer, but you can imagine what happened is that the manufacturer cut a big corner out of it, and then to become part of their extra income, and then they use this extra income to invest in stock market and real estate and everything else. So these dynamics, and so these industrialists has a strong influence in the government, but the peasant household, they don't have a representative to influence the policy in their favor. So even though the original proposal is to that direction, but when the political process came in, that it treats to the direction that in the end, the fiscal resources were used to boost some of the consumption, but in the end, it boosts the investment more because of this, the resources was routed via the companies. Many of them are powerful state-owned companies, and they cut a big fat corner out of that resources and use it for investment, so increase investment in the end. So it is this political process that makes this transition difficult. Yeah.
Much.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks. So let me stop here. Yep.
Again, many appreciative thanks for Martina and Karin and all the colleagues at the VIDC. I think this is a very stimulated debate for us as well, because I feel like this is the first time that I could not just talk about labor issues with my university students or colleagues, but also talk or debate this with all of you. So I'm very much grateful that Martina of all of the VIDC's colleagues invited me here and to share with you of my research observations in the past 5 years of working conditions in China. And I actually also this is also what Karin shows you earlier of the globalization, the journal. That is the papers that we accumulated together with Andreas Bieler in School of Politics and International Relations in my university about different debates on the worker situation in China, and especially related to the big question that whether China now is still a sweatshop factory or has been upgraded into a more industrialized country. And many of my points actually will follow Ho-fung's China booms situation, which I was much more looking into how does the manufacture process in China has been conducted and also influenced by the foreign investor. And not to forget that now, after 30 years open door policy since 1978, China not only invited foreign investments, but also lots of the domestic private investors, they are growing in China. But more importantly, my focus would be more on the people, which are workers. And what I wanted to see is, with all the respects of the double digits economic growth of the China's boom, if you like, those economic success in many of the scholarly and also NGOs observation is built upon the super exploitation of the workers' condition. That has been also Ho-fung mentioned that since the planned economy in Mao's era, that workers has been quite good stable supply for most of the manufacturers. Yeah? And in fact, in 1978, the open door policy, not just open for investors to China, it's also open to sell the cheap Chinese labor. So the government is the one to sell its own workers, its own people, for exchanging the economic growth, which we will see there's a lot of the backfires now, especially since mid-2000. And I also wanted to see that the dynamics of the resistance within the global economy that echo to Karin's points that where the capital goes, actually where the strikes go. But the strikes happened in China not immediately after open door policy. It has some time to groom the strikes or for the workers to understand their rights, which I will reveal to you those process in my presentation. And also, more closely looking, I will compare different regions of Chinese workers' condition. Part of the region is Pearl River data. Don't worry, I will give you a map where it is. And it's in the south part of China. Most of the manufacturers there are low value added and mass manufacture with the cheap labor. And another sector is more of the high value added Yangtze River data. That's in the a little bit up around Shanghai area. Again, I will show you in the map. And there are different resistance, if you like, of these different regions workers' strikes. Sorry. So what I wanted to answer is in what way that different locations, different kinds of commodity production chain would decide or would influence the workers' strike. At the end of the presentation, I add a little bit of what I wanted to pursue now is to see about the transnational workers' movement. I mean, now we're talking about the global value chain. Capital could be so globalized. Why or how could we see the labor movement could be also connected with the global value chain? I will share with you my doubts and also my observations, and of course, that is much welcome for your debates afterwards. So, started to have some conceptual considerations that we understand the specificity of capitalism, which you can read, I apologize. It's more about how does the production being shaped and influenced and being conducted through the process of manufacture. So my argument or my focus of capitalism is about production, it's the way of the production, which also would be linking to how do the workers relate to the way of the production. Let me give you a more empirical example, not to use such conceptual phrase. In the past, China has been seen as a low value-added production site. That's where the sweatshop or factory concept, word factory concept coming from about China, because they're everything made in China, but it's very cheap. It's very low value added. That's how the workers were treated also back 20 years ago in China. Now with the progression with China's industrial upgrading, China started not just to make the low value added electronic goods. They started also, I see a very good big sign of where I stayed, the hotel, is, for instance, mobile Huawei. Yeah? Some of you may use that, China made. So China does not just make the cheap product. They already evolved to make a more high value added product. Of course, you could argue that Huawei mobile cannot compare to Apple, agree. However, if you see, if there's only such a short time, for 15 years, China started just to make the outside of the mobile, but then they now make the thing, the chip, the engine of whatever of the electronic goods. China also bought of Lenovo computer, yeah? Of course, Lenovo cannot compare to Apple. But again, China has attempted to do a lot of the industrial upgrading. How does that change to the social relationship production? Well, that's the worry where I am coming from. I see those hardware progression. I see those improvement of the from the low value added to high value added products, but I don't see much of the improvement of the workers' condition. Yeah? And not to mention that the main debate of this is about the space of the civil society in China, whether there would be a civil society in China, and through the struggle and to come back or to fight back of the hegemony of the state. Again, I would have to say that it is not much to be seen in China about the civil society. The government's control is overwhelming, it's everywhere. Through the labor protests, through controlling the labor struggle, or controlling the trade union and labor NGOs, which I will show you later, I don't see much. Maybe I give you much of a pessimistic side, but I don't see there will be much space for civil society to grow in China. We can debate on that later, of course. Right. Again, that is what I many wanted to say, also echo to Ho-fung's point before, that it's about the cheap labor. And it's not just about the cheap labor, but also stable, reliable labor, that they could sustain the industrial output, they could sustain the manufacturing needs. Yeah? And most of them, they are migrant laborers. That causes problems later, which I would also give you more details discussion. And so that is the fabulous, splendid GDP number is created by the larger transnational companies, TNCs, and also the foreign investors. It's still purely depend on exporting market. There's a debate or argument that China now growing to have a domestic market. Yes, I do agree that after 30 years, China now is also growing to have a domestic purchasing market. But again, that depends on how much wage workers would have, how much salary do you have to purchase, and how much would you want it to purchase those necessities which are other than the children's education or the healthcare, which the government actually doesn't really provide for the migrant workers. Yeah? So that is also to see that, as we probably mentioned earlier, that China also has gone through a great economic transformation since the mid-1990s, about a good number of the state-owned enterprises reform, which is privatization. However, still, state-owned enterprises are the main drive for the China's economy. If you could argue that, well, Huawei is a private company. Yes, Huawei is a private company, but Huawei and all the successful private enterprises, entrepreneurs, they have very close link or network with the government because they need it. So it's difficult to distinguish SOE, state-owned enterprises, and private enterprises, since the private enterprises also go very closely with the state. Yeah. It is also that's what we keep repeating, and I would also talk more later about a large percent of the inequality in different regions, from coastal areas to hinterland, from Shanghai, Shenzhen to the second-tier, third-tier cities. If we are talking about the Chinese boom or China boom economic developments, actually only 9% of the Chinese people are having gained from this development. The rest are the have no people. They do not have the access to the economic profits because they are working class. And so we were thinking of the rising economic giants. Yes, we see the number, but I see more of the actual problem within the number, because the number actually should be sustained by the production smoothly, which it is not a smooth production mode or manufacturing process, or not as what we see from outside. There are a lot of strikes, a lot of debates, a lot of unsatisfactions from the workers. Here is the latest figure from the China Labor Bulletin, CLB, about the strikes. I would like to also show you the interactive strike maps, but unfortunately couldn't do that. China Labor Bulletin is a good source if you are interested about the worker strikes in China. You could see, at least from this chart, that the number of the strikes are increasing. It's always in a steep way to increase the strikes. A lot of people were asking that since the number of strikes are increasing, would VIDC, that is a labor movement to come in China? Well, I see that would be more of a question later, because there's a lot of strikes happen in China, but most of them, they are wildcat strikes. That means that the strikes, they happened or they started without organization. It's a one-off. And after the strikes, there's nothing follow-up. The workers, actually, they don't really look forward to have the fundamental ideological change, but they look forward to have the salary raise. They look forward to have increasing like 200 RMB, maybe 50 euros per month, and that's what they want. Yeah, they don't really want it to change the whole government. Okay. So what I wanted to show you is also the different region of the production. That is what I referred to you about the Pearl River data and Yangtze River data. PRD is in the south part, and Yangtze River data, YRD, is in the Middle East. I tell you why later on. These two are different. So, in terms of talking about the strikes or workers' protests, how do they organize? Well, I believe here that the trade unions play the main role if the workers are unhappy or wanted to get on strike. However, the ACFTU, All China Federation of the Trade Union, it is the biggest trade union in the world because all the Chinese workers are affiliated to this trade union. And each of the Chinese workers per month salary 2% would have to contribute to this trade union. But they are not representing workers. They are the richest, the most wealthy trade union in the world. They are not representing workers. They are part of the government's tool or structure, if you like, to pacify the workers' strike. You would ask, why ACFTU is a trade union, why they don't work for the worker or represent for the workers? This came with the historical background. When the People's Republic China established in 1949, the most permanent groups were workers, working class, and peasants, quite different from what they are now. So the working class, since they are the most important leading class of the society, trade union should be part of the government. So the logic was built then. Yeah? But of course, after the economic reform, after open door policy in 1978, China didn't follow the logic of putting workers as the most important leading class. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many strikes in China. So the trade union became such an awkward place. It should represent workers, but because it's part of the government, it cannot represent workers. It has to listen to the government. So then you would ask, how would the strike to be organized? Well, here comes to some of the labor grassroots NGOs. Most of the labor grassroots NGOs coming from Hong Kong or through Hong Kong. The Western Western NGOs, they will use Hong Kong as a window to support the grassroots NGOs in China. For instance, Oxfam or Ford Foundation. There are also some German foundations would support labor NGOs through Hong Kong NGOs. Yeah? What do? Those labor NGOs, they provide workers some legal consultancy, and they also teach workers about collective bargaining, the technique of collective bargaining, and also they would entertain workers after work activities. So if that's the case, then how do the government restrain the labor NGO? Well, the government, of course, they understand that the ACFTU, doesn't function as a trade union. This is what the government wants because they wanted to control the workers, right? Well, but they are also aware that there are a number of the troublemaker labor NGOs in China. So actually, Chinese government, they established a regulation in January this year to cut down or to have a stricter surveillance of those NGOs receiving foreign fundings. So if those grassroots labor NGOs, they receive foreign funding from Hong Kong NGO or from the United States or from Germany, those grassroots labor NGOs would have to be on the government's blacklist. What does that mean? That means the governments all the time would come to your NGO's office and to ask, what are you doing today? Why you are organizing such an event, invite these two people to brainwash our good citizens? It's create a lot of troubles for those labor NGOs. And in fact, it's not only about this kind of annoyance of the labor NGO, it's more about they also retain some of the labor NGOs leaders or chair people because they feel like those labor NGOs, they are creating those problems for the workers. Well, they are helping workers to organize strikes, which creating problems for the governments. So that's how the Chinese government actually control. That's what I'm saying, that the civil society's fight back or civil society's strength to stand up to be against the hegemonic state is difficult because the state is really very almighty in most parts of the country. If we come back to what I show you about the map of the Yangtze data and the Pearl River data, PRD and YRD earlier, What I wanted to say is, again, it's back to the production part. It's the southern part, the Pearl River Delta part, is more of the manufacturing base. It's more of the low value added and produce most of the household appliance products. They only just need cheap laborers. They don't really need a lot of skilled workers. Yeah? And the Yangtze Delta, which is the area close to Shanghai, is more of industrial, heavy industries, including machinery and also other upstream industries, more of the research and design parts in the Yangtze Delta. Okay, so I mentioned to you about where I come from. At the very beginning, it's about the production type would affect or influence the workers' relation with the strikes or workers' identity in that sense. I give you the background of the Pearl River Delta, which is more of the low value added, and Yangtze River Delta is more of the high value added production side in China. Then let's see what is the difference of the workers' condition in those two areas. The workers in the low value added production side in the southern part of PRD, they have more of the low value added jobs, of course, and they are having a lot of or very high turnover rates. When I was in the PRD area, I was interviewing different factories, and the factory owners actually told me that it is very difficult to retain workers because very small difference of the wage, of the salary, the workers can just walk away to different factory, and the second factory may be just a few hundred yards away from his own factory. So the workers actually, they don't have any loyalty in that part of the area because they don't require a lot of the skill or value-added jobs. And the working conditions actually were really bad. It is more of the long working hours and wage arrears. It's not about a lot about the illegal firing or discrimination of the workers. Also here has to be mentioned is when we are talking about, that's what we were talking about earlier about the consumption part, capacity of the majority of the Chinese people, not the most rich one. Most of the Chinese workers, they do not have the comprehensive social welfare system. The social insurance scheme I just started to promulgate it in China a few years ago, and the government actually put much of the responsibility to entrepreneurs, to the company, rather than the government would take the responsibility to build a social welfare system. That is started from the 2008 labor contract law. The government says that companies should provide a social welfare system, companies should provide workers' pension and everything. But in that sense, most of the companies, especially in the low value-added factories, they wanted to escape those obligations. And local governments, in order to keep those investors stay in that area, they usually don't really care. They can probably help the factories to escape the obligation to pay the social insurance. And that is also why that most of the workers in this Pearl River Delta, they are badly treated and they don't have the social insurance, they don't have the pension system. So what they would use their salary for? They wouldn't use the salary for consumption. They save their salary for whatever they need, for their own health insurance, for their children's education, and they wouldn't. That's why the consumption capacity actually wouldn't be high. Yeah. What would be the different condition in the Yangtze River Delta close to Shanghai? Yes, let's say more of the high value-added sector jobs, and the working environment is relatively stable and regulated because it is more of the R&D part. It's not just about low value-added assembling jobs. It's about the design. It's about the research and development. It's more about also they establish this high technology industrial park in Suzhou. Actually, that is a joint venture. The Suzhou Industrial Park is a joint venture with Singapore. And also the Suzhou New District, that is to help or to attract more talented human capital. And for attracting more talented human capital, Chinese government also are very good with that. Ho-fung mentioned about this hukou system in China. That means that different parts of Chinese citizens, they cannot easily move to another city. For instance, all the second tier or third tier Chinese peasants or citizens, they wanted to flock into Shanghai or Beijing because opportunities, educations, healthcare are better in Beijing or in Shanghai. So for the government to attract the talented workers, what they do is, if you are talented engineers returning from a good university of Vienna, you could actually obtain the hukou in Shanghai if you are Chinese. Yeah, of course. And hukou in Shanghai is very valuable. You cannot even buy that with money. You need network. So that's how the Chinese government actually promote the talented workers or skilled workers to return to reside in the region that is R&D driven. Yeah. But pay attention also, they really look down most of the low value-added jobs. The working conditions in the PRD are much poorer than the high value-added Yangtze River data. So I just quickly go through what I mentioned about, apart from the control of the state, those local labor NGOs, how do they survive? Well, if you are functioning a labor NGO, any NGOs needs funding, needs money. So most of the fundings from the PRD, Pure River data, the low value added manufacturing side, those fundings are from the foreign foundations. Those are the sensitive foundations, World Bank, Ford Foundation, Oxfam. And the Yangtze River data, those labor NGOs actually get funding from government. You would question, how could the NGO get funding from the government? Because the governments actually have the projects for the NGO to bid for, and the NGO actually, those NGOs, they would talk to me, they say that if they don't get money from the government, they cannot function, they cannot work for the workers. So better to have some money and get function. Just don't do those extreme things that the government doesn't like. But that is the thing. If you actually get the money from the government, you don't really would go against the government's willingness. So if you can see from a different funding source, you would understand more clearly that in the southern part, in the Pearl River Delta low value added area, those workers or labor NGOs, they were focusing more of the individual rights, the workers' unfair treatments, and they are more militant. They would actually organize workers' strikes. I'm not sure whether you've heard about the strikes. For instance, in 2014, Yuyuan Shoe Factory, 40,000 workers got on strikes on one day. That's a really big number, and also was helped by a certain labor NGOs. Of course, that labor NGO is on the blacklist of the government. Yeah. However, the Yangtze River data, the more of high value-added R&D production side, since it's cooperating with the authorities, so they are more about, they are organizing activities more mildly, more of the culture thing or after work entertainment. And not much about the workers' right or labor movement thing. Yeah. So I would just say that, the workers' condition and what kind of their activities of the labor NGOs, what I see is would be influenced, of course, by the government, but more of the production type. If it's low value added, then the government actually also doesn't care. If it's high value added, then like in Yangtze River data, the government pay much more attention to recruit the high talented human capital. And in that sense, the labor NGOs in the Yangtze River data are more obedience or more softer, if you like, to listen to the government. And in the Pearl River data, there's really more of the militancy kind of the workers or militancy type of labor NGOs. So I still argue that the issue with the Chinese production, it's actually result into the different kinds of industrial relations. I mentioned at the beginning that China now I see has improved greatly in terms of the hardware production. But with the restraints, as I show you, that not only they don't have an independent trade union, but also they restrain greatly of the civil society space, which is in the case of labor NGO, restrict of the funding. But it has to be noted that different NGOs would have different priorities in the government. The environmental NGO actually sell very well for the Chinese government, but the Chinese government pay a great attention on labor NGO because it is the root of production. If the workers organize collective strikes, it actually would ruin or destroy the base of Chinese economic growth. Yeah. So what I would say, this is in different regions, we could see different kinds of the labor NGO and different kinds of strikes. But as I mentioned, that would be possible to have a transnational labor movement. My own perspective is yes and no. We see the capital could be transnational. There's no doubt of that. Transnational companies, transnational globalization help the capital flies. But it's not easy to help the labor movement. In the sense that not only here I need a stronger organizational base. Of course, this is not the case in China, as I mentioned to you, that there's no centralized trade union, no independent ones, and the small labor NGOs, they cannot really contradict the government's willingness. But also, let's more about when I was attending a conference or a workshop organized by American Workers Labor Note Conference in Chicago in 2009. Actually, American workers, since I'm having a Chinese face, so look at me saying that, you Chinese, you took all over our jobs. So how could the transnational labor or workers movement to realize? I think it's a big debate. It is debates not just about organizational force, but also about, at the end, fundamentally, how do you see that could be shared upon the support of the workers? Yeah, I'm not saying it's not possible. It's possible. I saw some regional transnational work in Japan and China. Well, Japan and China, you would think that's not possible. No, actually, Japanese workers' organizations are quite in supporting with the Chinese labor movement or Chinese labor organizations to educate the workers. It's not impossible, but I would say this is much harder to be seen. Yeah. Thank you.
And thank you again for being with us, and thank you both that you've been here. We had a brilliant podium. Thank you very much.